to have BHAUTIK Joshi from Adobe Research in San Francisco joining us, and our program manager Dan, who's old friends with BHAUTIK from known for quite a while, is kindly agreed to lead the chat while his technology holds up. Yeah, really looking forward to hearing some of your takes, BHAUTIK, on media technology and futures from the perspective and vantage you have. Thanks, Dan.
Sure.
About it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thanks, Brian. I've just hit record as well, so we'll have a recording of this. Before we start with BHAUTIK, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners, the Woiwurrung and Bunurong language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, on whose unceded lands RMIT exists, but also the traditional owners of the lands on which we all are across the state, across the city, and maybe beyond as well. We acknowledge ancestors and elders past and present, and the traditional custodians and their ancestors of the lands and waters across Australia where we conduct our business. With that in mind, I want to acknowledge BHAUTIK and welcome BHAUTIK. BHAUTIK Joshi is an artist and researcher who's worked on all sorts of things. He has an interest in tools, technologies, storytelling, and has over 20 years experience in this field. He's worked as a researcher at CSIRO, Industrial Light and Magic, the photo platform Flickr, and is currently a senior research engineer at Adobe Research in San Francisco, where he joins us now. He's worked on all sorts of things, feature film quality, machine learning effects in Kristen Stewart's directorial debut, Come Swim, from 2017, which he also co-authored a paper with the director and actor about that, developing virtual reality pre-visualization tools for the film industry, and being the visual effects lead and director of photography on Jodie Lamasque's Into the Neural Forest. He, like all of us at the moment, is currently working from home, so we'll talk about that a little bit later on. But welcome, BHAUTIK. Thanks so much for joining us today.
I'm excited to be here. Thank you for having me.
Can you let's start maybe with your background and sort of your experience over the last couple of decades in media, film, and the tech industry.
Sure. I think a little bit unusual in a lot of my cohort, I guess, who I've ended up with, have come from an art background and ended up in technology. And I sort of came in the other direction. When I was very young, I always had a passion for art and passion for filmmaking, especially. And I really loved sort of visual effects. I'm, a big fan of, your big sci-fi movies and all of that. And I really wanted to get into it. But very early on, I realized that at least at the time, I lacked the knack for making art, right? I just didn't seem to have that spark there. There was something about it that just wasn't quite gelling at the time. So I made the decision to sort of do stuff that was adjacent to art, but not necessarily in it. And I ended up pursuing an interest in computer graphics because I figured if I kept on banging at it, eventually I would end up in film. And sure enough, I did. The way I got there was, I had a real interest in sort of computer graphics and visualization. So I remember when I was looking at university courses, I looked at biomedical engineering because it involved biomedical imaging, which is, of course, nothing to do with, very little to do with computer graphics. But I thought it was close enough, so I pursued that through university, and I ended up doing a PhD in the area. But it really sort of gave me a solid foot in computer graphics, and I got to the end of that, but I still wasn't satisfied because I wasn't really doing a lot of art stuff, and I wanted to get a little bit closer to it. So I kind of rolled the dice, and I took an entry-level job at Rising Sun Pictures, which is based in Sydney. So I did my degrees at the University of New South Wales, and I did my PhD research at CSIRO. But at the end of all of that, I decided to sort of just go a completely different direction. And I took this entry-level job at Rising Sun Pictures as a sort of a junior pipeline engineer because I really wanted to sort of I wanted to get into it. I figured since I was sort of, finishing one big thing, this would be a good opportunity to maybe try this out for half a year and see how I went. And while I was doing that, just for the hell of it, I applied to Lucasfilm, so Industrial Light and Magic over here in San Francisco, just assuming that they wouldn't reply. And I was as surprised as anyone else when they replied and they said, "Would you like to come out for an interview?" So I came out to the States. I did the interview. I just assumed that I was gonna get, like, I'd go and do the interview. I'd maybe get a cool like Star Wars T-shirt and a bit of swag, and I'd go home with a cool story. But I came in on the Monday for the interview, and on the Friday I had a job offer. And I went to my wife, and it's like, I guess we're moving to the States. And she was like, "Yeah, I guess we are." And that was nearly 14 years ago, and here I am still here. And the experience at Lucasfilm and Industrial Light and Magic was amazing. It was really nice being close to working with artists, close to working for artists, and from there I was able to sort of develop a bit of an intuition for what art is and what's important to artists, and what is a I mean, like, like a lot of things, it's art is about iteration, right? It's about slowly sort of working through an idea and fleshing it out, basically. And how do I build tooling to support that, right? So I built a lot of artist tools that went with that. Most of it was software. I'd build the sort of the 3D applications and tools that artists would use at Lucasfilm. But I ended up working on a bunch of TV stuff. I ended up working on a bunch of game stuff, which all combined when we started doing a lot of virtual production work. So this was way back when. So this was 2012. We did some early work on the virtual production work, where we were basically developing a completely digital stage where, at the time, everyone was in mocap suits. And then we'd sub in people on the mocap suits with hooked up to a game engine, and then draw them in the scene, so they're able to do takes on this virtual stage. And that involved sort of building a little bit of hardware, and that was all really fun. But it all sort of came to an end, I think, after the Disney acquisition, and things sort of changed direction a little bit. So I left, and I ended up going to Flickr, which was sort of another step sideways. So when we stepped sideways, I wanted to sort of see what else I could find in the space of sort of art intersecting with technology. And I know that's a bit of a cheesy catchphrase, but it really is sort of like, I'm very lucky to sort of live in that spot. And I did something completely different. So we were working with billions of photos, literally, on Flickr. And I worked for a few years with the data science team there, trying to figure out how can we use machines to automatically identify photographers who are cool and interesting, and how do we then automatically identify photographers who are perhaps really interesting but don't have a lot of exposure, and then bubble them up to the top, so people get to see interesting photos. So we worked on the recommendation algorithms there, and that was cool. And then towards the end of that, I was starting to sort of really get a bit of a bug for virtual reality. And I applied over at Adobe Research, and I pitched them a project idea that I had around how to basically work with VR imagery. And it was kind of a half a research project, half a sort of a tool that I wanted to build. And I ended up going to Adobe to do that. And that's what I've spent most of the last few years doing. And right now I'm working on sort of back to sort of machine learning a little bit again. So I'm working with, I'm sort of like the VR stuff has petered out a little bit as sort of the tools have matured. And I've gone back to sort of image processing, and I've gone back to basically teaching computers to see again, right? So a lot of the work that we did at Flickr was about teaching a computer to recognize things. So I'm working more on the data set generation side this time, and we are having a crack at a couple of visual effects problems like rotoscoping, and we want to see basically whether we can build data sets that would help a computer learn to do those kinds of really sort of like super boring tasks that are super common, but in a really high quality way. And that's sort of like, that's brought me back to visual effects, and that's pretty exciting. So
yeah, wow.
that's my last few years. It's been interesting.
So I'll just say as well to anyone who's here that the chat's sort of popping off, but any questions that you have for BHAUTIK, just drop them in, and we'll get to them later in the session.
Of course.
You've already sort of covered how you ended up at Adobe. So I guess what's the what's the most rewarding thing about your current role at Adobe? What sort of gets you out of bed and to the kitchen table in the morning at the moment?
Honestly, it's the people I work with. It's kind of nuts. One of the things that has been very exciting about being here in the Bay Area, really, it's sort of the area itself is expensive. It's difficult to live in sometimes, but the thing that sort of like, gets you sort of going and gets you into work is I hate to use an old word for it, but the candidature, right? The people that you work with. We have a very strong, I guess, academic community here, and I am learning stuff every day. It is crazy. I get to work with some of the best machine learning researchers. I get to work with some of the best immersive media, sort of virtual reality researchers, and every day I'm learning stuff. It's very, very, very cool.
And what about challenges? What's the hardest part about the job?
Honestly, just actually probably two things altogether. Keeping up an imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is a real deal thing. And just worrying that sort of like, when you're working with all these people who are so well published or so, they have this enormous list of credits, and they, have all these achievements, and you're sort of standing there next to them just wondering, seriously, like, why the hell am I even here? I don't understand. But then, then you discover that, they also have that exact same feeling, and it's just perplexing. But absolutely, there's that, and just sort of like, from the academic side, having to keep up all the time, it's a lot of reading, but it's worth it. It's cool.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked a little bit in some of these industry talks, we've talked about fields that are kind of adjacent, for better or worse, I call them creative adjacent fields. So maybe not specifically what you would normally think of in terms of being a writer, director, artist, or whatever it happens to be, but rather a field that sort of works alongside, maybe, as you say, provides tools to those sorts of people to help them sort of tell stories. So I wondered if you had thought a little bit about some of the opportunities or challenges, for people like yourself who are maybe working to support storytellers, or what we might think of as traditionally creative roles.
Right. I'd probably say the difficulty here is that I think film periodically goes through this, and because I'm going to use film as an example, but I think it equally applies to sort of like even music or photography, or any other sort of like creative field you'd like to name, and they go through these periods of technical innovation, I guess, right, where everything for quite a while, for maybe even 10 years, they will spend a lot of time sort of like chopping and changing and evolving, and everybody wants to figure out who they are relative to everyone else. And a lot of the traditional delineations that we have for sort of, I suppose, like director and producer doesn't change very much, but things like director of photography or visual effects lead or something like that, those jobs sometimes become blurry, right? And it helps to understand that sometimes people will do multiple roles, or they have got a deep understanding of another role but won't necessarily be doing it, right? So for example, the director of photography typically knows a lot about lighting, but they may not necessarily be the lighting director. And what we're finding is that technical people now are also doing a similar sort of thing, right? So the thing I did last year was that I was both director of photography and I guess research lead and visual effects lead on a smaller project that we were doing. But I found it difficult initially to, I guess, relate to people that I could do all three things, and I had to do all three things because they were sort of like three very related jobs. And I think currently the challenges are around sort of like understanding how, I guess, technical contributions fit into the creative workflow, and for people who are more old school, how they can also relate to it as well, because they're used to everyone as having such like well-defined roles, and right now everything is a little bit blurry, and that's currently an evolving challenge, I think.
Yeah, right. You've mentioned, you've dropped some buzzwords like machine learning and virtual reality and so on. So sort
Sure.
of the big question, and perhaps what what quite a few of us are interested in for all sorts of reasons, in terms of maybe we're reaching the end of our degrees and sort of wanting to find interesting things to do once we're finished studying, or some of us are interested in researching these things. So in terms of technology, media, creativity, what are some of the most interesting or exciting developments or research that we should be keeping an eye on, or looking out for in the near future?
Two stick out in my mind. Definitely machine learning. And machine learning is this weird, some people call it artificial intelligence, but I think to be a little bit more crisp and precise, really, it's sort of machine learning and understanding what it is going to do to creative workflows. And, how is it going to affect people? How is it going to do, how is it going to affect their day jobs? And it's very exciting, but it's worth understanding what it is and what it isn't. I'll tell you what it isn't, right? It isn't coming for your jobs. It isn't gonna it's not gonna go and replace artists all of a sudden. It's not gonna, it's not gonna go make entire lines of work redundant. Computers are just not that smart. They can't synthesize information. Machine learning is more about magnification, right? And what machine learning will do is that it will allow you to, I guess, magnify the work that you're doing, right? So when you're doing rotoscoping, for example, I'm going to bring that up as an example, right? So when you're doing ML assisted rotoscoping to sort of draw around the edges of objects, what's going to happen is that task now is going to be much faster and it's going to be much precise. So you're just basically going to be able to crank through a lot more footage. And you don't have to do the boring hair stuff that's going to be taken away. And you can concentrate more on, for example, more interesting compositing tasks, right? Because compositors don't just do rotoscoping, right? They can also do things where, they may be doing work in stereo or changing the order. It basically frees you up to do more interesting things, right? So there's that. And the other thing that machine learning will do is that it will allow you to explore creative spaces, right? So when you want to be able to start out and you want like 5 prompts, you want 5 writing prompts, or you want 5 visual examples that will just not necessarily represent the finished work, but that will just give you starting points that maybe you want to you want to riff against the computer to see where it's going to take you. That's where the real strength of it's going to be. And being a little bit more concrete, right, in terms of where the jobs are going to be. The jobs are going to be around teaching computers. And that sounds kind of cheesy, but that requires a very large degree of artist expertise, right? It requires having a good eye for sort of what is aesthetically good and what is aesthetically not, because frankly, a computer doesn't know it, right? And there are going to be lots and lots and lots of opportunities in creating data sets. There's going to be lots of opportunities in taking existing bits of footage and identifying stuff in them, right? So it's just drawing around and saying, okay, there's a person here or a car here, or taking an audio recording and marking it up and saying there's a word here or a word there. And all of these are sort of creative adjacent tasks. And that sounds kind of dreadful, but it's worth noting that sort of as a working artist, right, you tend to have, and I'm greatly oversimplifying here, but you end up with sort of 2 tracks of work, right? There's the track of work where you are working as an artist more or less on your own, right? And what you're doing is that your job is to create art that you've created, that that comes entirely from you. And that is less sort of that's less of an area where things like sort of machine learning or advanced technology is going to sort of really affect you all that much, because it's really based around your creative spark. But for the kinds of people then who are working the kinds of day jobs where you are you're working artist in an art department, what you're doing is that you're working on realizing someone's creative vision, or you're working on, say, training a machine to do a particular kind of artistic task, so that you can bundle it up and make it a little bit easier for the next artist who comes along. And for that kind of work, and I mean, machine learning aside, that does tend to have a little bit of a grind to it anyway. So in terms of sort of the difficulty or the reward for that kind of task, it's about the same. It's a little confusing, but but there's a lot of opportunity of another area which would be interesting is, of course, virtual production. Virtual production is a huge one, and that's definitely significant, especially in Australia, over the next sort of over the next maybe sort of 5 to 6 years as it evolves as the technology. And that means that in Australia, where you have English-speaking crew who are relatively cheap to hire compared to the rest of the world, there is going to creativity and game technology and film technology.
Sorry, Bhartik,
yeah.
you might have dropped out a little bit.
Okay.
I thought it was just me because I'm having terrible internet.
Okay.
So maybe just go back to sort of the end of the machine learning bit and a bit
Sure.
more about virtual production. Sorry.
No problem. I heard it popping in and out. It didn't disconnect for me, so it was odd. Okay. All right. Let's go back to this. Let's go back to the top, right? So, I just finished out the thought about machine learning. So I'm just going to say, like, it will definitely touch what you're doing in the next sort of even 2 to 3 years in terms of, you're either going to be training it or you're going to be using it. So let's go back to sort of virtual production and the opportunities for that in Australia. And I mean, Australia has always been an interesting spot, especially for film production, because, and actually to a lesser degree games as well, because you have English-speaking crews who are trained and they know what they're doing. They're professional crews, but they're relatively cheap because it's the Australian dollar versus everything else. And virtual production is another way of just sort of multiplying that, right? So what you can do now is that you can set up as many stages as you like now, and these stages will allow you to sort of transport your actors and your production to sort of anywhere that you like. But it doesn't just happen, right? It doesn't just automatically happen. And there is an enormous amount of art that goes into it, right? So I remember when I was back at ILM and when we did the early virtual production tests in 2012, and there was something about the end result that was remarkable, right? So like a good friend of mine would, he'd put on the mocap suit. I've tried it on before. They're very uncomfortable, a lot of spandex and like ping pong balls everywhere. But anyway, you put on one of these and he'd walk onto the set and he was C3PO, right? He got down, he even got down like the walk and everything. And we'd have this one scene that we'd use to sort of keep on retesting it, and it was remarkable sort of how flexible it was. But the thing that wasn't obvious to all, like, this parade of executives who sort of, and other tech people who sort of came in to take a look at it, was that there was hundreds and hundreds of hours of artist time that was necessary to get it to the point where it was usable, right? Like you don't just you don't just say, hey, I want a desert and I want to drop some people into it. You've got to model it. You've got to model where the lighting is going to be. You've got to model the materials. You've got to model simulation and physics. That's another big deal. And then on top of all of that, you do all of that modeling and simulation. And then what you've got to do is that you've got to shrink it down so that you can't just arbitrarily keep on throwing detail into it. It's got to run at like 60 or even 90 frames per second, right? It's got to be whatever like multiple there is of the frame rate of the camera that you're running. And it's got to run fast as well. And there's an enormous amount of artist intuition and an enormous amount of tuning that's necessary to make it work. So, there are going to be a lot of opportunities for, I guess, sort of like what you consider sort of the traditional 3D artists in terms of like modeling, texturing, but there's also going to be opportunities for people who do game dev stuff and also photographers. That's a big deal, because one of the fastest ways of getting a model into a computer is to, is the art of photogrammetry, which is basically walking around an object or walking around a scene and taking a ton of photos and then using that to reconstruct a 3D model. But it isn't just reconstruct the geometry. You then reconstruct it, and then you need to work on the texture so that it's not just like this flat texture. It's got to have reflections and specularity, and all of that is a serious discipline, and it's enormously in demand right now.
I'm just going to drop into the chat. I can't remember if it was you that shared Memories of Australia.
Yes.
Which is kind of an amazing example of photogrammetry. So this guy who moved away from Australia many years ago, was back, but obviously before the pandemic, and took a whole bunch of photos of things and scanned them all in and created a pretty amazing virtual film or memory book or whatever you want to call it in Unreal Engine, and it looks pretty stunning. There's only a couple of moments I think where I'm like, oh, okay, that's a bit. Normally it's animals or animals are tricky, but
Yeah,
it's pretty
absolutely.
spectacular what he's achieved with that.
Yeah.
So machine learning, virtual sets. Anything else that we should be keeping an eye out for?
Oh gosh, I mean, there's so much. Immersive technology is definitely one of those things that always seems like it's just going to be around the corner, but it really is. We saw a big sort of explosion in virtual reality a couple of years ago, and what's interesting about it is that it hasn't gone away. It's kind of stuck. It's not really growing at the frantic pace that it was before, but it's definitely not going anywhere. And there's definitely a big interest, especially sort of like, I guess sort of segueing a little bit into sort of pandemic stuff. But like, now, especially now that people can't travel, it's a really good way of getting away. And there's been a surge in popularity of it then. But what's really interesting is what's going to happen in a couple of years when either Facebook or Apple is going to drop their augmented reality glasses. And that is going to be pretty significant. So we've seen some really significant progress on I guess if you like sort of like augmented reality glasses that are see-through, right? So you wear a pair of goggles on your face that are relatively compact form factor, and you can see sort of like computer stuff overlaid on the front. And some of the very difficult optical problems there have been solved. It's a question of now, like, can we miniaturize it and get it into sort of a comfortable pair of glasses? But, so far it looks like, and again, I can't speak to it directly because I don't know the facts, but so far it looks like, it's probably about maybe 2 years out where, one of these two is most probably Apple actually is going to drop one of these, and that is going to it's going to drive an explosion in terms of content that people are going to want to see on these headsets. And again, having experience with 3D, having experience with photogrammetry, and being able to acquire stuff, again, that sort of intersects with virtual stages even a little bit. Be able to sort of capture performances and getting them ready to play. So capturing them in stereo and then having them so that they'll play back comfortably on a pair of goggles is going to be a significantly useful piece of experience. And the thing that's driving my observation there is that one of the reasons that virtual reality didn't take off, I guess, quite as much as it should have, was that it was just difficult to make that content and there wasn't enough of it. So now that these big giants are sort of making these headsets, one of the things they're doing is that they and sort of like associated companies are hiring an enormous number of artists now. It's the artist groups at Apple are gigantic. It's unbelievable when you find out about the numbers. But they're there sort of generating this content and front loading it so that it's going to be available at launch. And then there's going to be a continued high demand after that, because for one of these pieces of hardware to thrive, there needs to be sort of like a constant stream of this stuff being created.
Yeah,
So,
right. So I guess you mentioned the pandemic. For better or worse, we're in it still.
Yeah.
So I guess how has this affected Adobe? How has it affected your day to day? Are there any positives or negatives that you can sort of identify?
I was probably one of the few people that it inconvenienced perhaps a little bit more than others at Adobe. And the only reason for that is that I am one of the very few people at Adobe, like you can count on one like a single hand, who are doing any sort of like hardware development or hardware research, right? So part of my day job is just building camera rigs. It's building sort of like exotic, weird sort of like machine learning stuff, and it requires a lot of hardware. So I had to sort of in dribs and drabs get a lot of that hardware back home and just build a lab at home. But for the vast majority of people, they're doing software work. And Adobe was already significantly online, I guess, if you like, right? So it was a company where they were pretty already okay with sort of people working remotely. In fact, the entire video team. So people who make Rush and Premiere Pro and After Effects, they have been a geographically distributed team with the vast majority of the team already working at home. they've already been that way for sort of 4 or 5 years, right? So, and because we did a lot of work with them, it was already sort of like fairly natural. So the move to being, because it is, largely speaking, a software company, the transition to being online was really not a big deal. Probably the only really difficult thing is trying to set up an office space at home when you have family, right? So, I mean, right now I had to sort of like shoo my family off so I could take this meeting, and that always feels a bit weird, So, yeah.
So I guess, you've mentioned lots of things here: machine learning, virtual set technology, even sort of photogrammetry and building 3D models and so on.
Yes.
I mean, we touch on parts of all of this in the course,
Right.
in the program. There are other programs at RMIT that are covering that in sort of great depth. But I suppose, there are students here who are going to be wondering, if I want to work in these fields, and what skills beyond the stuff that I'm getting at uni,
Right.
where do I start? What do I put into a search engine? What sort of tutorial should I be looking up to sort of that sort of thing? So where does one start
Sure.
now with the kind of wealth of information that's available and tutorials and
Right.
so on? Yeah, what's the best thing to kick off with?
I mean, each one of these are going to have different, I guess, entry points, right? So, and the thing to qualify before all of this is that, when you go, and especially if you come from an artist background, when you go and do something that's a little bit more technical, calibrate your expectations, right? You are not going to learn if you go into it thinking, okay, so what I'm going to do is that I'm going to do this tutorial and I want to learn every little technical detail that is needed to do this, and I'm going to learn it and it's going to be useful, you will almost definitely end up frustrated. When I want to learn something new technically, when I want to learn something new artistically, I don't go in there assuming that I'm going to sort of like master it on the first pass. What you want to be able to do is that you just want to be able to get a taste for all of these things, right? And you want to be able to, you basically want to be able to create something end to end without necessarily understanding all of the technical details. Because what you want to develop is you want to develop an intuition for what is going on. And then once you have a good intuition for what's going on, then you can start filling in the technical details. Because if you try to fill in those technical details without an intuition, almost always you're just going to end up having a bad time. So, so starting off with machine learning. Machine learning has really turned an interesting corner in the past few months, in that there are a number of services that you can go to online that are mostly free, that allow you to try out machine learning right there in your browser. Right. So what you can do is that you can search for what's called Google Colab notebooks. And what you want to be able to do is that you want to be able to grab one of those and you can just run it in your browser, and you can interactively do machine learning stuff right there in your browser, right? So you open up one of these notebooks and it's going to have these long lines of code, but what you can do is that you can very quickly figure out what parameters you can change. What number do I need to adjust to give me a creatively different result? So one thing I would recommend doing is, just as a starting point, if you're interested in visual stuff, look up Google Colab notebooks that do style transfer. Style transfer is a good entry point into machine learning if you're interested in doing that. And also look up these things called RNNs for text generation, two relatively easy starting points. And what you can do is that you can find, there's a whole bunch of Google Colab notebooks that are out there. And I can share a couple with Dan if you're interested, and Dan can share that. I've written a couple myself that are, happy to sort of share with you folks if you want to start messing around with that. But what's nice about that is that it's not using your compute resources, right? So when you run one of these things, you are you are using one of Google's computers. So they've got this, in a server rack somewhere in California, they've got this giant beefy computer. And what you can do is that you get access to that to run your stuff. It's quite impressive. It runs fairly quickly. And again, it's a really good, quick way of developing an intuition for sort of like, okay, what is it that machine learning does and what is it doesn't do? So that's a good starting point there. 3D and virtual production, that's a huge topic. And I think, Unreal is interesting. You can get like a student license for Unreal, and if you like, you can run that at home to do sort of like home stuff. But I think you'd probably be better served by focusing on, and you can try like, setting up your own. You can take like a spare screen that you have and try putting like stop motion actors in front of it behind like a virtual set. But the amount of technical expertise to actually build a virtual production end to end right now is fairly high, right? There's just a lot of little technical things that you need to knock out and little weird exotic bits of equipment that you need to make it work. And you're much better served by just messing around with creating 3D stuff, right? So there's one that I would recommend right now would be Blender. Blender is a
Okay, am I back? I think I'm back now. We're just waiting for Bautik. Sorry, everyone. We can hear Bautik now.
There we go. Are we back?
Yeah, we are. Both of us dropped out at the same time, which is great.
That's amazing. I'm sorry, we lost some of the questions, but that's okay.
The last word was Blender.
Okay, yes, I was gonna suggest Blender. There's a bunch of great tutorials that you can find online. The things that I would recommend if you're interested in doing that would be mess around with actually 3 things I'd recommend that are kind of fun and accessible. One of them is just making things out of blocks, right? So just drawing cubes and making blocks. And have a look at the sculpt mode as well. That one's really, really, really fun. And it's relatively easy to get into. And if you got access to a 3D printer, you can even like print out your stuff as well if you're interested in doing that sort of thing. But yeah, that's kind of fun. And also running fluid simulations and smoke simulations. That's relatively easy in Blender. But again, it just gives you an intuition for sort of like, what does the iteration look like in a 3D workflow? And there's a bunch of great YouTube videos on doing this. AR and VR is another sort of like slightly weird one in terms of trying to figure out what you can do in that space. And I think it's worth remembering that AR and VR are both, I think the correct framing for them is less a technology and more sort of a medium, right? It's a medium in which you can deliver content, that you can deliver stuff that your audience wants to see. And, you don't as such sort of like create stuff specifically for VR. I mean, you could, but the idea is that you still need to go through your standard sort of 3D workflow for creating VR content, and then making it work for the medium, but then it requires some technical glue to stick it all together. Things that, if you want to just sort of like play around with it, one of the things that I would recommend would be A-Frame. A-Frame is an online tool that you can use for creating VR scenes, and it runs inside a web browser, and it's pretty nice. So that's a really good one to start with if you're interested in sort of like just cobbling a few things together and seeing what it feels like. And for AR, I don't mean to like toot the company horn too hard, but a really good tool for prototyping AR stuff is actually inside Adobe Aero, so AERO. That's a super cool tool for just quickly assembling scenes that are going to be interactive, that basically work on your phone, right? And the idea being that if you can author stuff that works well on your phone, there's a pretty good chance that it's going to work pretty well on these glasses whenever they drop as well. So.
Yeah, cool. Thanks so much for all of that. I guess we do have some questions that we'll get to in a minute, but I just wanted to spend a couple of minutes maybe talking about our shared interest in machine learning, which is the capacity for weird humor.
Yes.
Do you want to talk a little bit about some of your experiments and some of your lessons and so on that you've been running there?
Yeah. One of the things I've been trying is, okay, so I had this, I guess, like hypothesis that there's no reason for artists to sort of be locked out of technical stuff, right? And again, sort of coming back to this idea that what you want to be able to do is that I think it's possible for artists to get an intuition for what's going on in super high tech stuff, and without necessarily getting stuck into all of the details, because in the end, you're interested in using it as a tool for generating content rather than necessarily learning how many parameters they're used in training and how big the neural network is. Right? That's not really what you're interested in. You're interested in just using it. So I've been messing around, I guess, with some examples with computational humor, which has been a long-standing interest of mine. And there's a couple of really great online humorists who basically partner with machine learning to basically write jokes or write puns or generate weird words. So one of the examples that I used was generating. I would basically feed it like 400 examples of a particular thing, and I'll get it to sort of generate novel examples, right? So I fed in a whole bunch of what did I did? It was I fed in 300 80s action movies, and I wanted to see what kind of titles it would generate, right? So it came up with titles like Superman Ninja 3, The Bloodening. It was one of those nice things where we were learning basically how do you tune the machine learning so that it isn't just sort of like regurgitating the training that you give it, but it's starting to synthesize novel things all on its own. And it's really sort of interesting seeing the workflows that emerge from this, right? So when you are partnering with a computer, a large part of this that is somewhat unstated is that it requires a high degree of curation. Right. So what we'll do is that the computer will generate 100 examples, and maybe 20 of them are usable. So how do you? But that's not good or bad. It kind of just is. But understanding that is the understanding that is a thing is absolutely like one of those like I guess developing a relationship with machine learning and understanding how is it that is going to affect your workflows, right? It's probably also worth mentioning that there are a couple of really interesting, I guess if you like, language networks that are being developed that can do things where they're able to synthesize not just individual words, but chunks of stories, right? As got mentioned in the chat, right? So, and they're based on these very large models. So you may hear of these things called GPT-2 and GPT-3 that are trained on gigantic volumes of text. And what's interesting is that you feed it a prompt and it can do things where it can write a short story and it can identify things like themes and it can identify things like characters, and it will riff on them and make them recur during the course of the text. And again, there's a high degree of curation that's needed to sort of make it work, but it's definitely possible. And it speaks a little bit more to that idea that I mentioned earlier on about using the computer to give you prompts from which you want to start with. It may not necessarily be the finished result, but it's definitely a good place to sort of explore ideas.
Yeah, cool. So yeah, Leah's just dropped in this sort of almost RPG-esque thing about AI Dungeon that creates stories based on what you type in. And I think you shared in one of your lessons, you shared this, I can't remember his name, Robin someone that had done...
Robin Sloan, I believe.
Yeah, who'd done this thing with a kind of a mail-out RPG thing with procedurally generated maps and stories and so on, which is kind of interesting.
Yes, super old school Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah. Okay, so let's go back. So Brian dropped in early on, and please keep dropping in questions. Hopefully we'll get to them. If we don't get to them by 10:30, I'm sure BHAUTIK will be happy just to sort of give you some answers offline at some point.
Absolutely, yeah.
So algorithms are often getting critiqued in terms of the way they control media flows. What are the positives and negatives for you in terms of possibilities and potential problems?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really, again, developing that intuition for what algorithms do and especially what they don't do is super important, right? Because we give these machines much more credit than they deserve, and we start projecting almost like sci-fi levels of intelligence on them when they're just simply not there, right? So people, I mean, like, if I were to use sort of like a social analogy, people treat facial recognition as completely unbiased and as completely neutral, whereas it's really not. It's super biased, and one of the issues with the technology is that it's been oversold as such, right? It's been oversold as completely bias free, as completely objective, and it's just really not. And when you're working with algorithms, when you make them part of your workflow, it's really important to develop that intuition for, again, like what does it do, what doesn't do, where does it lean towards, and understanding that it is a cog in your creative workflow rather than the whole workflow itself. If I were to use a concrete example, when I was working with Kristen Stewart on and the rest of the crew down in LA on this film, and we were using style transfer to, like, our concept for the movie was a a painting that she did in a garage, and she wanted to see whether we could redraw some of the scenes in the film in the style of a painting. And I initially went into it just assuming it's like, that's fine, no big deal, right? I can just use this style transfer and it'll be done. But you feed it into the computer and it does stuff that you don't expect. It does stuff that the director doesn't want to do, and it turned out to be like, and that's the reason we ended up writing a paper on it, was that, like, putting a leash on it and making it do what we wanted and making it steerable was difficult. And the development of that intuition is hard. And again, sort of like, the role of the machine became it almost felt like a separate collaborator in our creative project, right? And I basically would be there basically just driving it, right? So I'd receive instructions from the director and the producer about what they wanted it to do, and I just see what happened, and I end up having to sort of develop that intuition. So this, if you was, I think probably the main thing that you want to avoid is that you want to avoid the idea that it's just going to do everything for you, because it really
won't. Okay, so there's another question here about how much of the stuff that you learnt as a student, whether it was an undergrad or a PhD student, how much of that do you use in your current role? Does anything bubble to the surface?
I had stuff from high school which I'm using in my day job. Sooner or later it all comes back. I've pretty much used everything, and I think I guess on the box, my job is and like formally speaking, my job is an engineer, right? And very early on in your career as an engineer, you pretty much learn all the skills you're going to need very, very early on, right? And then what sets you apart from like a junior engineer to a senior engineer, or even beyond that, right, is the experience that you have. And you get to be a good engineer if you're able to draw on your experience and understand stuff that you've learned previously can be used in another context in a different way. But that same knowledge is transferable. And there's part of what I guess I was asking, like, what are the things that I really enjoy about the job? I guess, quite aside from sort of like how much I'm learning all the time, is the fact that I can sort of take all this, random bits of experience that I've had from all over the place, right? And reuse them in novel ways and just experiment with them, right? And then, especially with creativity is fun because it's different from science and it's different from formal engineering in that things don't have to be exactly right. They just have to, they've just got to feel right, right? So you also have a lot of room to sort of take stuff that you've learned in the past and just use it in all sorts of like novel and unexpected ways. And that is super valuable and super rewarding.
Yeah, I was going to say, I was madly typing in the chat, but I was going to say it's definitely the same for me with my communications degree, is that, you learn a whole bunch of tech stuff, but tech stuff changes every year. It's much more about
absolutely
working collaboratively, the principles of being on a set or being in a creative space and how to work well in that area that sort of lasted for me, definitely.
Absolutely.
Sorry?
I was going to say, just like, there's a related thing that I think is probably relevant. I remember when I was at ILM, I was very interested in how they hired artists, right? And like, generally speaking, how do people who work inside larger creative organizations hire artists? And I remember one of the things that really stuck out in ILM was that they didn't hire people based on their technical skills. Right? They didn't hire them because they knew XYZ package. What they were really doing was they were looking for people who were able to demonstrate their creative talent and demonstrate a willingness and a flexibility to learn whatever technical stuff they needed as they went. Right? There is, especially when you're working with these big sort of media organizations, they tend to have these very custom tool sets that are in-house that you're never going to learn externally anyway, right? So, having having the willingness and the flexibility to be able to say, hey, I do have experience in these packages, but I understand how they could be used differently, is definitely a way of, not emphasizing saying like, I have 10 years of experience with Maya. That's not the thing you want to say. You want to be able to say that I understand it, but then I understand how it could also be used in other contexts as well.
So there's a couple more questions. There was one about, do you think the pandemic will be a further driver for AR, VR, remote collaboration technologies and sort of general uptake of this stuff?
Yes. is the short answer to that. Heck, I mean, I saw a great example of that last week, and it's also in ways that you wouldn't expect, right? I was at a conference last week that I attended, and one of the best things about it was hanging out in the virtual lobby. And this was not wearing a headset; this was just wearing a pair of headphones, and it just had a top-down view of this, basically this hotel lobby, and I could see the other attendees that were there, and there were just little circles, right, with like a little profile picture on it. But what happened was that you'd have this spatial audio, right? So the idea being that you'd have a direction that you're facing, and if somebody was behind you, you'd hear them as if they were behind you. And what happened was that just like as you'd see at a normal conference or any sort of like gathering of like 100 people, people would cluster into groups to talk. And they would, and you'd see it on the overhead map, like kind of like almost like a Zelda-like map, right? But then I spent some time hiding in a bush talking to someone. It was kind of fun. But the thing is, people would arrange themselves into circles. And what was really fascinating was that I would walk up to a circle and people would shuffle aside for me to be able to physically get into the circle so I could hear whoever it was in the middle talking. It was fascinating. So these technologies around people craving this contact, they're craving the feeling of wanting to be sort of close to other people, and AR and VR is a surprisingly great way of doing that, especially sort of around that spatialization. So again, don't underestimate sort of the value of spatial audio and spatial audio authoring. That's a big deal. And meetings in VR, once you get past sort of like the fact that everybody is on a slightly different headset with slightly different hardware, if you can find like a lowest common denominator, it can be great. I've been to a bunch of meetings in VR and you think they wouldn't work, but they're really nice. And your memory of meeting people in VR feels like when you're in VR on your own, your retention of it is going to be so-so. And there've been a couple of interesting studies on this. If you are in VR with other people, it feels like you are at a real place. It's this bizarre little mind hack thing that happens, but it totally happens. It's definitely pushed the technology along. Will it stick and become a common thing? I guess it all depends on what the future of work looks like once we are done with the pandemic. How much of this stuff is going to stick, right? So yeah.
Yeah. There's one final question. I'm going to be a little bit careful about how I ask it.
Yes.
But it's sort of around ethics and accountability and so on. So I am going to be very careful about how I ask this question.
Sure.
But I suppose maybe from a professional standpoint, how do companies, but also perhaps how do individuals working in some of these tech media areas, perhaps where there are some ethical considerations, how do you balance those considerations with the need for with the push for innovation or the push for creativity?
Okay, it all depends on the company.
Sure.
And it depends on the company culture. I can semi-officially talk for Adobe. There are projects that we've scuttled because we've decided that we thought that it was unethical, right? There are projects that we've shelved. We have the way it typically works is that we have interns who come through during the summer. We also have independent scientists who work at Adobe, and they more or less get to work on their own research because we want to see interesting things that they're going to do. And that research tends to get to a certain degree, we function like a university department, right? We publish papers, we have like an ethics board, we have all of the things that you typically see in a university. And I guess after the experience that we had with Photoshop, sort of warping reality and seeing the sort of the big dent that it left on the world, we tend to be quite shy about pushing technology forward until we are sure that we have spent a very long time checking the ethics of it. There are a lot of things that we could do that we don't. And I don't mean to be sort of like tooting our own here. Again, I've been burned by this and it's been quite frustrating at times. It's kind of like, I worked on this for a long time, we can't do it. But I think, at least Adobe's particular line on it is that, we're a big enough company that we can, even if we've sunk a lot of time and effort into research, we sometimes decide not to go with it ultimately because we decide that it's going to be too much of a risk ethically, right? And one of the things that we do, for example, is that we have we have a yearly, I guess if you like, sort of like a big Adobe love-in, where we present some and it's sort of like, we do all our major project launches once a year, but we also present some of our more interesting research projects to the public. And one of the reasons that we do that and we bundle that all together is that we can see we can see basically what do people think of this, right? Because to a certain degree we are an echo chamber, right? We're a tech company in the Bay Area, and sometimes it's hard for us to get a read on sort of like, well, what do people think about this? What are the risks here with doing this? So sometimes we will present stuff in a larger forum because we also don't know everything, right? And when we start, as machine learning moves forward, as things get more complicated and difficult, there are going to be when we start building tools that can edit larger and larger chunks of reality, right? Do we really want to put that forward? I don't know, right? Because what's Adobe famous for, right? Adobe is famous for taking sort of like really complicated creative workflows and making them simple, right? But if we've got a simple workflow for I'm just going to pick something, but you can imagine okay, so if there's some sort of thing where, for example, you can, one click remove a person from a video, right? I mean, that's not something you just release. You have to really, really, really think about it. And you think sometimes we'll come down on the side of going we don't want to do this because it's just not right, And it's worth noting that tools like this already do exist in the academic community, right? But they're not. What's different about doing it in a big company is that if we were to then take this tool that's already available, that's freely available for people to download off GitHub and run, if we put it into an Adobe tool, it's going to be XYZ amount easier to use, and it's going to get in front of that many more people. Maybe that's not a great idea. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm very, very conscious of time. People have got other classes to run off to.
No worries.
I just want to take this moment to say thank you so much for joining us at the end of your workday. And thanks to everyone for coming along, for asking questions, for dropping all these things in chat. I'll certainly be going back through the chat to grab a few things. But yeah, thanks so much.
Absolutely. Thank you, Dan. Cool. Awesome. All right. Gotta drop off then.
Bye. See you.
Yeah.